we'll have to relog again. Yeah, so I'm going to ask you, I want to check out how many are from Delhi in this class. So all those of you who are from Delhi, based in Delhi itself, please raise your hands. I can only see 3 hands up. 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Excluding Delhi, how many of you, now you can put down your hands. So Delhi is not counted in this question. Please, Swati and Vidyan, please lower your hand. Anil, lower your hand. Everybody, just 1 second, I need to check what LCN office wants from me. Hello?
हेलो
हाँ जी,
वेद मैम
हाँ जी,
मैम अपना LC1 ऑफिस से बोल रहा हूँ अकाउंट सेक्शन से मैम
जी। हाँ जी, so where were we? So I'm going to ask, how many of you, include Delhi for the included, but don't raise your hands again. How many are from North India? Okay, quite a many. How many from East India? Okay, the majority of the class seems to be North India. So now everybody lower your hands. How many of you are from North India? No, sorry, East. East. I have, I think 4 hands up or 3 hands up. Okay. From West of India? Lower your hands, please. So 1 from West. Okay, thank you. Lower it down. How many from, anybody from South? Wow, not even 1. How can that be? We've always had students from all parts of the country. I'm from South India, Rahul. So why did you not raise your hand? Okay, you were raising your hand and then put it down. Okay. So great. We do have Tamil Nadu. Okay, great. So we do have Amini India here before us. I'm from Central India. Okay, I was dividing into 4, but we got a 4th category, 5th category also Central India. Anybody from the islands? No, we haven't reached out there yet. All right, anyway. So I'm sure that all of you have done your work over the weekend. We started yesterday with Benkalu's case. I'm going to show you my slide on the, I'm from Nepal also, Alil Karki. There was a Karki in my batch. You might know he became the judge of the Supreme Court, Bharat Bahadur Karki. He was with me in my master's program. Welcome. Going back to yesterday's discussion, we were looking at relevant facts. So I'm going to share the slides I shared with you yesterday again, and you have to identify what is an important fact which is missing, which has not been included in that slide. Okay, so when we when we were talking yesterday, we said we have to give relevant facts, and all those facts which are going to be used in arguments. So this was the slide I shared with you yesterday, and you have to identify in this slide, is there any fact or facts which are important and relevant and are missing in this slide? But what we were saying yesterday was that you can omit the unnecessary details, but the other principle is also very true, that you must not omit a relevant fact. So there's something on the chat. Let me see. Okay, nothing on this question. So anyone? Any important fact which is missing? Speak up. Unmute yourself and speak up.
Ma'am, the religion of the people, the person who died and the people
Why do you
who
think
killed that person.
No. Why do you think that's a relevant fact?
Because they belong to separate communities.
Remember again, religion, the fact, that fact is a relevant fact that will be used in arguments. So whether is it anybody's argument that because he was a Muslim, because they were the Hindus and therefore they fought and killed, and whether the section charge has got anything to do with the religion? If not, then religion is not an important fact which is missing. Always apply this test. Am I going to use this fact in my arguments? So if you have read the whole case, nobody has raised the issue of the religion of the parties involved. So that's not a relevant fact. But there's another fact, very, very important fact, which is missing here. Yes, speak up. I can't see the full names because the class is big and I'm only seeing certain portions of the name.
Ma'am, the motive is missing here.
The motive is never a relevant fact for imposing criminal liability, excepting for one offense, which is an offense of abduction. In all other cases, and also if you look at our slides which we were sharing earlier, what are the range of state of mind? Motive wasn't there. Motive may reinforce existence of intention, but motive itself does not, it is not relevant for imposing criminal liability.
Okay, ma'am.
Ma'am, I think burnt match. I think, ma'am, burnt matchstick.
Burnt matchstick was burnt matchstick is part of the investigation. What they found in the investigation on the facts itself, there's a very, very important fact which is missing. The most important fact. What is the charge in this case? What is the accused person being tried for?
For murder. Murder.
For murder, what is the essential fact which must happen?
Ma'am, Moinuddin died.
Yeah, so there's no mention that this man died.
Ma'am, injury to the human being.
No, injury is not sufficient for murder. For the murder charge, one has to die. And there is no mention in the statement of facts that Moinuddin died as a consequence.
He was burned alive, ma'am.
Yeah, but that is also not mentioned. No?
Ma'am, mentioned.
Where? In this fact that I'm showing you.
Not in this.
That's what I'm saying. That in this narration of facts, what is a very relevant fact which has gone missing? Because we need to pay attention to both the things. Avoiding irrelevant facts and must not omit a relevant fact. So without a statement that he died, there is no charge of murder. There can be no charge of murder whatsoever. It could have been an attempt to murder, It can be a grievous hurt, it can be anything else, but it cannot be a charge of murder unless there is a statement of fact that the man died. So this was just an example to show that sometimes we add up unnecessary information and sometimes we end up omitting the relevant information, and we have to be paying attention to both these things. So, okay, second group, investigation. What are the information in the case available about investigation?
Ma'am, investigation started after the cousin of Moeddin, the deceased, lodged a FIR. Then police went to the crime scene with the forensic team and photographer. Police collected burned body, empty matchbox, burned matches, and arrest watch was also recovered, and it was stopped at 11:40 p.m. Then police recorded statements of servants and villagers. Police did a mapping of the crime scene also. Then the forensic team also did the post-mortem examination. Police recorded confession statement of accused in front of magistrate. But the case doesn't depend on the confessional statements. So police took statements of 19 witnesses also.
Okay.
With the
That's a good narration.
With the help of these statements, police found out the motive. That was basically the land dispute between the second appellant and the deceased. And this dispute was also testified and proved by the documentary evidences too.
Okay, that's pretty good. Yeah.
Police then arrested accused on 22 and 23rd February.
Okay, so now let's look at my collection of some of this information which has just been provided. So first of all, the FIR has been filed on the morning of that night when the incident had taken place. And this has been filed by a cousin of the deceased person.
Yes.
It is based on hearsay information. Hearsay means that he was not an eyewitness. He has heard that this is what has, the first informant was not present on the scene of occurrence. This fact is, this part of the investigation is just to say, for us to learn that anybody can file an FIR. It is not necessary that you should be affected, you should have been present, you must be connected with the offense. Nothing of that is required. Then the visit by the police inspector happened at the place of the occurrence. At the place of occurrence, what they found, that is also narrated. It is all part of the police report.
Yes.
So they found the house burning. They talked with the doctor of that place and a photographer to take note. This is all collection of evidence.
Yes.
Inquest was done. Post-mortem examination of the corpse was conducted.
Yes.
And recovery of evidence. This is wristwatch that stopped at 11:40. So 11:40, the wristwatch stopped means that the incident took place around that time. Burned matches and one empty matchbox from the outer part of the room was also found.
Okay.
No arrest was, no one was named in the FIR, and the appellants were arrested on 22nd. Now see the time difference between 19 to 22nd.
Yes.
And anyone who remembers what is the date of confession?
Ma'am, 23, I think.
23. So this is that within a day, they have made a confession. And they said, no, we were tortured by the police.
Yes.
For 3 days or something, they said.
Yes, ma'am.
So what could have happened? So they said the 3 days. So what could have happened actually? That on 19th, they were actually picked up. They were kept in the police station without a formal arrest, tortured. And when they agreed when they confessed, then arrest is shown. And this is a reality of police stations. Something which neither the lawyer emphasized upon, nor the court has taken cognizance of. But something, we as lawyers get to learn that many times people are called to the police station, they're kept there without any official record of they being kept there. So in fact, the story of the defense that they were tortured is not an unlikely story. Sometimes they might be saying it just for the heck of it, but because of the dates given here, and that's where if you're wanting to analyze the investigation and the facts in the light of the dates, then 19th February and 22nd February and 23rd February become relevant. We want to make that argument that no, the arrest has been shown to be 22nd for official purposes, but they were actually picked up on 19th. They were tortured for 3 days. And it is only after that they made a confession. So in that sense, we were to make that argument at a later stage, which hasn't been made. They just said, they've not referred to the difference in the dates of 19th and 22nd. They just said we were tortured for 3 days, and their lawyer certainly did not do a good job of pointing out that these were the 3 days when they were tortured. So if that had been brought in, then maybe more evidence could have been made. But the lawyer did not do a good job on that front. And that's where it's very important to look at every single information which comes into view at the stage of deciding what arguments to make. And if you miss out an important connection, then your client loses. And that's where it is very important for lawyers to be meticulous in examining facts. And this is something you will learn when you participate in moot courts. Moot court competitions are where problem is given to you, certain facts will be given, and then it will be told that this is what happened in the first court, and now appeal is there, argue for either side. So another question which I'm going to ask you, and you should think about it, that once we come to the arguments on the defense side, I'm going to ask you the question whether, in your understanding, what do you think, whether the two accused persons were represented by one lawyer or two lawyers, whether one lawyer could have represented both the clients, both the accused person?
Yes, I think one lawyer represented both the accused.
Ma'am, there were two lawyers.
Ma'am, there were two lawyers.
There has to be two lawyers. Because in this case, there is a conflict of interest between the two accused.
Yes,
one is saying, both of them are blaming the other for setting the house on fire.
Yes.
And they're trying to say, I'm not responsible for it because I did not set it on fire. So one lawyer, if there's one lawyer for both of them, he cannot stand up and say on behalf of one client that it is not this client, but the other client who has done it. And then take a reverse position. So ethically, it is not possible. Legally, no, in this case, it is just not possible. And therefore, it is important to look at the positions taken by the parties concerned. There were 5 of them. Whether all the 5 strategically, one is the strategically, because most of the defense would want to have independent lawyers so that they can, if some lawyer had forgotten to mention something, the other can bring it. Sometimes they are at loggerheads with each other. They're saying, no, my name is not there. I'm not the one who has been involved. I've been involved because of something else and I've been falsely implicated. So as long as it is saying that somebody else has done it, that's a one story where the same lawyer can represent. But if you're saying it's not me who did it, it is who did it. So certainly you require 2 different lawyers. So what we call is that a conflict of interest. If there is a conflict of interest between 2 parties, one lawyer cannot represent them. So, okay. What is the third group, Job?
Confession of Venakalu.
So what has Bengali confessed? What is he saying?
He said that there was a tension between the deceased and the Bodlaram, that is second appellant. After they had been served with wine, they went to the house of the deceased and locked the house with his lock. And the second appellant, that is Bodlaram, set fire to the house with a matchstick. The fire was extinguished by wind. Then the second appellant beat Qasim Khan, one of the employees of the deceased, who was approaching the cottage and again set fire to the house. In the second incident of setting fire to the house, he gives a part to himself and also to the second appellant. He also admits having thrown dust in the eyes of the people who were rushing from the village side for putting out the fire.
So look at in this statement, when Kalu is saying, he's not putting any blame on himself. So he's saying there's a tension, the motive part of it. Bodlaram had a motive because he had a dispute. I do not have anything. I am not involved. We just had toddy and there was tension between. So I was drunk. So one part of the story saying is that we were served toddy and wine and we went. Okay, I should show you the slide. So when you look at the you need to compare the two statements and then you will understand that how the two of them are blaming each other for what has happened. So they set the house on fire again. He is not now. He is now in the second round. He is not saying I did it. Then they did this together, kind of we did. He's kind of being vague on that one. While the earlier statements, he is very categorically mentioning Bodlaram. So that Bodlaram had tension and they went together, yes. But I was just there standing. I did not do things. Bodlaram locked the house. He set the house on fire with a matchstick. And then the fire was extinguished by wind. So one of the questions you will be looking at a later stage will be, suppose at this stage, they were caught that he set the house on fire, but the fire was extinguished by wind. And if the charge is of arson, setting the house on fire, whether it will amount to an attempt to commit the offense. And in the attempt, we say that you have done the act which is required for you to do it. The consequence did not follow. So we are kind of making when we come to that section on attempt, we will ask this question that he had now lighted the stick. At this point of time, before he had thrown this stick, the stick itself got extinguished by wind. So whether he has done the last ultimate act required was to throw it onto the hut. So if the fire got extinguished at that stage, then compared to that stage, he lit the fire. He had the lighted match in his hand and he's caught. And then the other persons extinguished the thing. Whether it will make a difference that he's caught with the lighted match, which was extinguished by the one who stopped him, or the incidents where he had lit it, but before he could throw it, it got extinguished by the wind, or he had thrown it onto the hut, and after the hut has started burning, but there's only a small portion, but the wind still extinguished it. Three different scenarios. At what point of time can we say he has committed the offense of attempt? So in this case, has Bodlaram already attempted to set the house on fire? What do you think?
I think, ma'am, yes.
Yeah, so at this stage, because he's already done what was in his power, he had done it. The fact that the house did not catch fire was not because of his action, but because of the third party intervention. In this case, it is the wind. Then Bodlaram beat Qasim. He is again saying that it is the other who has done it, who was a protagonist. Qasim was coming to protect the Moinuddin. Then the house was set on fire again. They set fire to the house again. So here is again they saying that they is not saying I or he, and he threw dust in the eyes of the people. Where the coming. So what I was doing was only to assist him. It is he who is responsible. This is what is the confession from Venkalu. What is the group 4 saying? What is the presentation by group 4?
Confessional statement of appellant number 2.
Right. So you have to keep this track of what has Venkalu said. And then now let's look at what has Bodlaram said. And this will show us that because they are blaming each other, they're putting the actual action of the setting the house on fire on each other. Therefore, they are against each other. They're not only saying we are on one side and state is on the other side. They're saying that no, I am not responsible, he is irresponsible. Yes. So Bodlaram statement?
Ma'am, he said that he and appellant number 1 were drunk on that night. Appellant number first locked the door of the deceased. Then he set fire to the house. Then when the victim started shouting, that alerted his servant and he came out. Then he gave a blow to Qasim, his servant.
Who gave the blow?
Appellant number 2, Bodlaram.
Okay, so this is a statement both of them saying that Bodlaram beat up Qasim.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Supported appellant number first statement that he started beating the villagers when they came, and appellant number 1 was throwing dust in their eyes. Within this time, half of the house was burnt down. While first appellant said that the cottage was lighted by both of them, the second appellant denied it and said that it was done only by appellant number 1. That was a major difference in their statement.
Yeah. So when because when you look, no, I've kept this Venkalu statement also on screen. So you're saying they set the fire to the house again, in which they're saying he's not absolving one. He's saying that both of them had done it, while Bodla says no, it is Venkalu who did it. So Venkalu says Bodlaram did it. No, first time certainly Bodlaram did it, while Bodlaram saying that no, Venkalu did it first, and second time also he only did it. So both of them are saying because the death has been caused by fire, so anybody has to be responsible for the death. It has to be that person who has set the house on fire. But whether Bodlaram says anything, why would Venkalu do it? Because Venkalu is saying that Bodlaram has an enmity. What is Bodlaram's explanation to say why has Venkalu done it?
Don't know, ma'am.
So these are the kind of comparison and contrast that you should look at. That though Venkalu gives an explanation as to why Bodlaram did whatever he did, Bodlaram doesn't tell us why has Venkalu done it all. Both of them are saying we were drunk. So that is one possible defense they're wanting to take, that because we were drunk, we did not know what was happening and therefore we should be absolved. So there are a lot of line of reasoning possible from what they're making a statements about.
Can there be a reason that both of them were drunk, so Venkalu must have done it?
No, both of them were drunk. Both have done it together only. So here you can see the contrast between the two, but what they're trying to build up is that we were drunk at that point of time. And of course, drinking per se is not, especially when it's a voluntary drinking, that is not an exception. Doesn't absolve you from criminal liability. But this is what the statements are. Then what's the group 5 job?
Ma'am, our job was to look after the procedural, yes, ma'am.
Okay, tell us.
So first we will look the elements of the crime in this case. So there's a human being who is capable of being punished and who's
no. Procedure. No. Procedure. Listen. Procedural aspect I meant is which court started, where. So what we have seen in the investigation itself, that there was an inquest and a post-mortem done. So inquest is done by a magistrate. Whenever a death happens in unnatural circumstances, magistrate comes and holds an inquiry into the cause of the possible causes of the death. So that's the inquiry. Now after that, the body was sent for post-mortem. So when the case started, when the trial began, which court did it begin?
Ma'am, it's begun in the Sessions Court.
Right. So that is what procedure was. It was first the session judge. So what did the session judge hold?
Ma'am, session judge hold that the confessions which they denied that they are making the confessions under police pressure, but the session judge hold that it is admissible in evidence because due to the fact that they were arrested on 22nd and the confessions are made on 23rd. So they are saying that they were tortured for 3 days. So the story defense was not raising this issue, so they said it is voluntarily made and it is admissible in evidence.
Right.
So based on that evidence, they said that is a offense under section 302 because the intention was clear and there's a motive also because there was a land dispute between the accused and the victim.
Okay, great. So when you look at my slide here, I've also added some more fact as to what the consequence of that one. So they were, no, it's a 1950, what is the year of the judgment?
1955.
1955. It was only 1955 that the law changed, which said death penalty or life imprisonment, you can give either. So one thing we learn is that within 2 years, the trial had been completed. You'll find that this time will increase over the years because as the areas increase, it takes much longer for a session judge to arrive at a finding. So in this case, within 2 years of the incident, this sentence had come for the first round and both of them were given death. 3 were acquitted by the trial judge. And whenever a session judge, the other learning we get here, that a death penalty has to be confirmed by the High Court. Merely because the session judge pronounces it, it's not final. Automatically, the High Court has to confirm it. So against the session judge decision, one, the reference goes to the High Court, and the other two, and these two people, Bodlaram and Venkalu, also filed an appeal against their conviction and sentence. The High Court dismissed the appeal and accepted the reference, confirmed the judgment of the. It's in 1 year. It's within 1 year because the session judge judgment is dated 18/1/1954. So within a year, they had the whole investigation complete, trial complete. Within a year, the session judge has given us the judgment there.
Yes, ma'am.
Then 2 appeals by special leave. Now, what does special leave mean? Anyone?
Special leave means it's an appeal. Ma'am, it's ma'am, whether it is admissible in the purview of Supreme Court or not, I think so.
Ma'am, can I? So
yes,
special leave is like an extraordinary power of the Supreme Court to approach Supreme Court when you don't have, when you have a question of law which is not settled, and I think Article 140. Something I don't remember, ma'am.
Article 136. Article 136. Now look at these dates again. So in January, the session judge judgment had come. Within 4 months, on 15th April, the High Court also gave its judgment. So look at the speed with which the things are happening. And sometime when you do research, we want to find out how much time does it take for an ordinary murder trial to complete. If we were to go by this judgment, it is 1 year of trial time and then 4 months of appeal. Today, nothing happens at that kind of a speed. So I just mentioned this for our learning purposes rather than, these are not relevant facts, but I'm drawing your attention in this discussion as to how much rich knowledge is available if we want to learn. So coming up to the special leave appeals by special leave, I need to check this again. This is something which has just come to my mind now. Special leave is when the High Court refuses you to allow to go to the Supreme Court. You are unhappy with the High Court judgment. You want to approach the Supreme Court. Then you make an application to the High Court saying, I should be given permission to appeal. And the court grants you the permission. So, and sometimes they may refuse. If the High Court refuses that permission, then they will apply to the Supreme Court under Article 136, seeking for special leave to appeal. So it is a case where the High Court did not permit them to go in appeal, but they wanted to, and therefore they approached the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court admitted their petition and permitted them to appeal to the Supreme Court. So again, we have learned a little bit of procedure that from a judgment of the session judge, certainly it has to go to the High Court. From the High Court, it may go to the Supreme Court in certain circumstances. One can always add more knowledge to it. Now, Group 6, defense arguments. Of course, technically, we should have had the, in the sequence of things, we should have the prosecution arguments first. But I don't know why I've put 6 as defense arguments. We'll hear defense first.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, please.
Ma'am, the defense wants to establish two facts or two things from the given facts.
Your mic is making more noise. Either your cloth is brushing against your mic or something. There's a rustling sound.
Okay. Hello?
Yeah.
Ma'am, right now? Ma'am, the first thing is the confessional statement was not admissible as evidence just because they are not voluntarily given, and there are contradictions between the first and the second appellant. When the confessional statements was taken, it is not reliable actually.
Right.
The defense wants to establish the things, and the second thing is the accused were retracted at the sessions court before the session judgment. It is found that confessions are wholly unreliable. So the defense wants to establish these things.
Yeah, so there are two things about the confessions. So we had two lawyers, confessional statement, they are not admissible for reasons. They're not voluntarily, one contradicts the other, and have been retracted already.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other argument we have?
Ma'am, and even the furtherance of common intention is not established from the investigation, ma'am. Actually, they are charging for directly 300, that is for murder, but the furtherance of common intention is not established, ma'am.
Right, so there's a technical argument.
Yes, ma'am, that is fine.
One, they said that what is our action? We had only set the house on fire. So even whether I did or I didn't, we would put it together also. What we have done is merely setting the house on fire. And he died, it is his bad luck. We were not intending to cause his death. That's the substance of the argument. They are saying, we agreed to it. No, we are ready to the extent of saying that, yes, we had the intention to set the house on fire.
Just because we want to give some fear, ma'am.
But we only wanted to set the house on fire. We did not intend to kill Moinuddin. So that's first argument. The second one, they said that 302, the importance of this distinction, that they have been charged under section 302. So on its own, 302 means that I individually committed murder. And read with 34 would mean that I, along with someone else, did it. So they said the charge is not 302 read with 34. The charge is 302, which means that I should be held solely responsible for my action. So if suppose, and the argument in the first one is that confessional statement, I am saying he did, he is saying I did it. So when you have not, the prosecution has not proved beyond reasonable doubt as to who set the house on fire. And if the charge is not by 34, by reference to 34, where there is a common intention that I, along with him, having the common intention wanted to kill this man, I cannot be held for 302 read with for 302 because there is no 34 read. It's a very, very technical argument which has been taken, and this is how we learn to build argument, examining what is the charge. If the charge was 302 read with 34, it means that we do not know who did what action between the two of you. But the actions of you two together are responsible for the consequence which has followed. So that's a very important understanding. We'll be again returning to the common intention liability, that in what cases we say that. And we said in this case, we are saying we had used the word conspired. So conspiracy meant that they had a meeting of mind. They both wanted to do it. So in this case, who are Balaram? Yes? Yes, please.
It could be added as a defend arguments or not, I don't know. But the defense is saying that the prosecution witness 11, 14 are being manipulated by the prosecution just because the first instance, the prosecution did not disclose the names of the accused, ma'am. They just told that it was fired by some other people. They did not tell the name at the first instance. After that, in the investigation, it is written that after that only, with the police and the relatives of the person who died are being with the policeman, they actually went to the prosecution witness, and after that only they disclosed the name. So the defense is trying to establish the fact that they were manipulated. The prosecution witness 11 and 14 were manipulated. So I don't know, it could be added as a defense argument or not, but I have a point.
Right. So, no, certainly the reliability of the parties. So in the previous slide, what we have seen is that one is the objection on confessional statement. Second one is on the offense, the section which has been mentioned in the offense and the action they have done. That 302 is not made out. One reason that I have not caused the death. I have only set the house on fire. Second one, my liability is not by reference to 34. That's not, there was no charge against either of them. And certainly the point which has been just made, that the people, if you look at the prosecution story, they said that people were cold, and when they tried to stop it, these accused persons prevented them from stopping the fire or rescuing the person, and nobody was mentioned in the FIR. So if this was the truth that we were the ones, then FIR would have certainly mentioned that as well. So that's an important observation information to pick up from the arguments. Yes, so appeal was dismissed. What are the reasons for the decision? Group 7. What are the reasons given by the Supreme Court for dismissing the appeal?
Yes, ma'am. I have 3 reasons for dismissal the appeal.
Okay.
The first one is the 2 eyewitnesses, prosecution witness number 4 and 7, who reached the spots while the cottage was still burning, had been supported by a large volume of oral evidence. Second, and the confession of both the accused are fairly detained, and the learned magistrate who recorded them has certified it was voluntary given. Third, the only objection taken to the confession of accused 2 before us was that he was suffering from fever, but nevertheless he was in full possession of his mind. Even he was suffered from fever did not prevent him from giving a detailed confession. Therefore, these are the reasons for of proof beyond reasonable doubt.
Right. So they said that one aspect of the reasoning is there's no confession, but in any case, they have not. They said for us to rely, we are not giving our judgment on the basis of the confession. So even though the objection to the confession not being admissible is not acceptable, but in any case, we are not resigning. We are not relying on the confessions, because there are any number of witnesses which have cogently proved that this is the appellants who have done this. Group 8 on the reason for decision relating to framing of charges. The group 7 was on the aspect of confession. Group 8 on the framing, because the argument was that 302, 34 have not been applied. It's only 302. So how have they disposed of that defense argument?
Both accused.
Yes.
Both accused Raval Penta Venkulu and Bodla Ram Narsia have been sentenced to death under Section 302 in IPC for murder of Muhammad Moinuddin. And Section 32, common intention, and Section 300.
34.
Section 300 for definition of murder and Section 302 punishment of murder were charged. Supreme Court also charged Section 300 and 302 because they said that the gravity of intention of murder was high, and Supreme Court upheld the decision of the Session Court and decided that this was a clear case of murder under Section 300, awarded the death penalty under Section 302.
Okay. So what are we learning here is that when they said that we have been charged only with 302, because that's what the technical charge was mentioned. But when the charge was put, the words used, the Supreme Court says that, look, what are the actual words used by the judge when they explained what is the charge. It says you are charged with assisting the other present accused, both of them, with common intention. So the fact that when they explain the charge, they mention common intention, even though in writing the Section 34 was not mentioned. But the notice, the information, the accused was clearly told what is the charge. So the charge was not that you alone have committed the offense. The charge was categorically saying that you with the other accused, with the common intention on such and such that have committed the murder. So therefore, it is a technical omission. The 302 read with 34 is not mentioned, but they were clearly told that it is with the common intention that you're being charged with. So that is the rationale, that is how the judge has explained the omission. And what has been provided for in the common intention to done it, the charge has been proved because there is a clear evidence that each one of them actively contributed to the burning of the cottage while the man had been trapped inside. So therefore, even though 34 was not mentioned, you were told that it is together they've done it. Both appellants have lighted the match and set the house on fire. Their subsequent acts in repelling the attempts at bringing the rescue of the trapped men clearly shows that they had the common intention of causing death of Moinuddin and not only setting the house on fire. So suppose the man, Moinuddin, was too drunk at that point of time. The house was set on fire and he never woke up. They never heard a noise, any noise from the inside. And they said, we did not know Moinuddin was inside. Then the possibility of giving them a doubt that maybe they did not know, maybe they saw Moinuddin actually having drinks at the party. So they left the party, they spent some time more somewhere and they assume Moinuddin was in the village. And they set the house on fire. Something could have perhaps gone in their side, but because he raised a noise to save himself, these other people were trying to, so they were very clear there is a man trapped inside. So suppose they did not know it is Moinuddin who is inside. They thought somebody else is inside. Would they escape the charge? They'd rather there's somebody. Suppose it was not actually Moinuddin, it was Moinuddin's servant who was sleeping inside at that point of time. They had set the house on fire with the intention to kill Moinuddin, but then it turned out that it was not Moinuddin but his servant who got trapped and killed. What do you think? Will these two people be still liable for the death of that other person whom they did not intend to kill?
Ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Under Section
Transferred
301.
malice.
Yes, transfer of intent.
आप लोग तो खुद ही बहुत पढ़े लिखे हो, आपको तो क्लास पढ़ने की जरूरत ही नहीं है. Perfect. 301. So what is the rationale? Because what is punishable is killing of a human being, intentional killing of a human being. It does not matter which human being got killed. You intend to kill one human being, another human being killed in the same circumstance, the liability is still the same. Okay, great. Group 9, on the evidence of eyewitness, because there was the statement that the argument which was being suggested, the third group of argument on eyewitnesses. So how did the judge respond to that argument? The reason for decision on this aspect of the arguments, evidence of eyewitnesses.
Ma'am, there were total of 19 witnesses which were produced before the judge, of whom prosecution witness 4, 7, and 8 saw the occurrence directly. They were present at the site. And the rest, which were working on the field, also came running towards the hut. So they also saw the occurrence of the incident. And The prosecution witness 8 was sleeping outside the hut, so he was the direct witness of the whole incidents because he saw that the hut was being locked by the miscreants. So, and the judge said that as the prosecution witness 8 saw them locking the door, the intention was clear that they wanted to kill Moinuddin inside the hut only.
Yeah, so another reason, another explanation which has come from the judge is also why was they not named in the FIR? They were too afraid. These witnesses have said they were too afraid to mention who was the person who have done it. So it is not, so somewhere what we are coming across is that these two persons were not one-time offenders. They were some goons kind of a persons, and therefore so one has to explain now that if there were so many eyewitnesses, why were they not named in the FIR? That explanation, that also has come from the prosecution, that as to why the names were not included in the first instance and why they got included at a later stage. On the question of intention, because merely you did it is not sufficient. What is required for the offense of murder is that you cause death with the intention to causing death. There are other circumstances also, we'll come to that. But today we are only focusing on the intention. So what have the judges said in this case relating to intention? Group 10.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, judges has charged them with common intention, which deals in section 34. And when section 34 says that when criminal act is done by several persons in furtherance of the common intention of all, each of such person is liable for that act in the same manner as if it were done by him alone. So whether they both are blaming each other, but they have the common intention to kill someone. So the judges have charged them with common intention.
No, but that's no, because how the judges have ensured, what we said the other day also, that we know they had a common intention because they were both doing it together. They came together, they did the things together, they fought the rescuers together. So all that is showing common intention. But how do we know that they had the intention to kill Moinuddin? So in relation to that, the judge has said intention to kill Moinuddin is clear from the following facts. One, accused took care to lock the door from outside so that his servant could not be of any help to the deceased, who has thus been trapped in the cottage. Furthermore, the villagers were also prevented.
Ma'am, degree of intention also matter, no?
No, we'll come to degree and all when we'll come to the distinction between 299 and 300. First of all, remember when I spoke to you last class?
Yeah, ma'am.
How do you prove intention? How do you prove what are the facts to be looked at to determine whether this person had intention or not?
Yeah.
Reasonable forcibility plus the desire for the consequence.
Yeah, ma'am.
So whether these facts are suggesting that they could reasonably foresee that the man trapped inside will die and they desired for this. Is there any doubt about these two facts? If none, then intention is proved.
Yes.
So when they have locked the door from outside, they are preventing anybody to rescue them. They are preventing any other persons to provide any help. So what is the possible explanation? Why are they doing it? Are they doing it only to set the house on fire? Or they are ensuring the death of the victim as well?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, they want death of the victim because Bodlaram has an issue with the Moinuddin.
No, listen. Motive adds to. Motive does not replace. Suppose we found no motive, because when you look at Venkalu has got no motive.
Yes, ma'am.
Does Venkalu has any motive?
No, ma'am.
Then why he should be? If we were to say that motive is important for conviction, Venkalu has got no motive to kill this man.
Yes, ma'am.
So in case of no explanation. So it may be that Bodharam and Venkalu are good friends. So these two together, Venkalu decides to help Bodharam in what Bodharam wants for the settlement of his disputes or whatever there is. So nobody has challenged that. Nobody is saying, no, there was no dispute. So even if there was no dispute, many a times you find murders and you do not find what is the motive. Motive doesn't matter. But if motive can also be found, then it is all the more explanation. It makes it all the more possible that the reason for the accused person to act in the manner was because he had a purpose also for why he was doing them. So long-standing dispute between the parties has been proved. It may be. I was reminded of a film by this last one, that Moinuddin was not very popular. And it was kind of possible that there's so many people, there were only two of them. So the whole village could not have been prevented from by these two. So maybe Moinuddin was a bad person, but that's not relevant, whether it's a good person or a bad person. Before you people were born, there was a film called Mregya, in which there was a village Patel who was a traditional depiction of a exploitative zamindar. So he was that kind of a person, and everybody was afraid of him. So one of the Adivasi villagers, he was very good at hunting. So Mregya is akhet, hunting. And there was a man-eating tiger, which was bothering a lot of people, and nobody was able to catch him. So the British government employed this Adivasi youth to kill the man-eating tiger. And what he ends up doing is he actually stalks, like he would stalk a man-eating lion, a tiger, and he stalks and kills the village Patel, this very bad zamindar. So for him, he was relieving the human beings in the village, his co-villagers, from the tyranny of the Patel, who was, in his opinion, much worse than the tiger was. So I was reminded of that film because they said that maybe he was not popular. And therefore, in this particular film, everybody was not thinking of this youth as the criminal, but as the savior. And he himself also did not think that he was a killer. He was doing the right thing in his own opinion. And that kind of ties back to the conversation we had earlier, that who is a criminal, whether society must look at you as a criminal. So in this case, he does kill a human being, and the villagers don't believe that's the truth. He himself doesn't believe that, no, he said he was not an animal. He was not a human being. He was an animal. He was the man-eating lion in the shape of a human being. That was his understanding of the situation. But that's not relevant, whether he was a good man or a bad man. And of course, this youth also got his death penalty in that particular film as well, because it is not relevant whether the man was good or bad, whether he has done anything in the past with you or not. You know, he might be your sworn enemy. The power to cause violence to the other is with the state alone. So therefore, the judge here was saying it is not relevant whether Village Patel was popular or not. That is completely irrelevant to determine whether Bodlaram and Venkalu had the intention or not. So intention is coming from the first one. The facts are indicating that there can be no other explanation. The only possible explanation for their action is that they wanted Moinuddin dead. And this is clear that this is what they want, not because they were shouting, yeah, we want him dead, but because their action spoke. So there's no other explanation. Group 10, 11.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Ma'am, our topic was law of reopening. Sorry. It was about law related to reopening of the concurrent findings of lower court.
Yeah.
So, ma'am, in the judgment of session, the session judge, they provided a judgment was on the basis of section 302. but more people were involved in the case, so the section 34 was not included in the judgment. So the High Court should be reopened the case, reopened the investigation, because the section 34 was not included.
No, I think we need to make a distinction between the specific focus I wanted you to look at was that what they said, that you need to relook whether the finding of fact that Bodharam and Venkalu have done all these actions. This needs to be re-examined. That's the argument of that. We kind of didn't list out all these reasons. These are all part of the defense arguments. So they have addressed this question also, that why will we not reopen the concurrent findings? So the principle we learn is that if there is a concurrent finding of facts, so what happens is that this district, at the session judge, there were all this evidence given, oral evidence and documentary evidence. On the basis of appreciation of that evidence, the session judge said, we are convinced that these two have committed the offenses. Then this was challenged. The finding of fact was also challenged. That no, you have not proved that it is the two of us who have committed the offense. But 3 of them got, no, 5 were initially charged, 2 of them got acquitted, 3 of them were acquitted, 2 were convicted. So this 2 also said that this conviction is wrong. We were not the one who have done this act. The High Court examined that, and so have in the first instance discussed the positive evidence clearly implicating the 2 appellants, supported by a large number of oral evidence. So if they found that on the face of it, when they look at the records, they do not find that the High Court has actually looked at the evidence to determine whether the conviction has been rightly made or not. Because there will be 2 aspects of appeal. No? One will be whether they have been convicted rightly, whether they have been convicted rightly in the same under the correct section, whether the punishment given to them is appropriate. So after discussing and accepting the testimony, the High Court observed, in addition, confessions of both the accused of fairly detailed and learned magistrate who recorded them has certified that it was voluntarily given. The only objection taken to the confession of accused 2 before us was that he was suffering from fever. A perusal of the confession was, however, shown that he was in full possession of his mind, and even if he suffered from fever, it did not prevent him from giving a detailed confession. There is no good reasons for reopening the finding of the courts below that the oral testimony adduced in this case was by itself sufficient to prove the guilt of the appellants. So when they found that the 2 courts have concurrently agreed that yes, these 2 persons did these activities. And the confession statements, when in any case Supreme Court said we are not relying on it. But even the High Court has found that the confessional statement was before a magistrate who has certified that it was voluntary. So even though they later on withdrew it, they did whatever, there was a contradiction, etc. So in any case, we are not basing our conviction on the basis of the confession. We are basing our evidence on the basis of the oral evidence, voluminous oral evidence. And therefore, there is no reason for us to examine the question of fact again. So the principle we learn here is that ordinarily the Supreme Court will not reopen the question of fact. They will only look at questions of law. So when they said that, no, you have to reopen the findings of the court, the findings of facts, the court said, no, there's nothing apparently wrong with the man, because sometimes it does happen. We did do a case in the Supreme Court where the accused person was alleged to have killed 4 people. He was a domestic servant in the house, and he killed 4 persons. The engineer, the man whose whole household it was, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and 4th one was, I forget. Okay. I forget. No, there was a 4th also. Sister. His sister and a daughter. So these were 3 mid-20s people and 1 2-month-old baby were killed. So he claimed that he was a child on the date of the offense. The matter was before the session judge. The session judge held that no, he was not a child on the date of the offense. Then in the High Court, when he went, and he was given death penalty, he went to the High Court. There, his own lawyer, the legal aid lawyer, said that I'm not challenging determination of age. So the matter, again, the High Court also confirmed the conviction and death penalty. The matter went to the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court, also, the Supreme Court looked at the medical evidence to say that he was not insane and confirmed the death penalty. So imagine 3 courts, the matter has gone up, but neither the High Court nor the Supreme Court looked at the determination of age. This fact that whether he was a child or not was examined only by the first court session judge. And we went in a review petition in that one, because I was very convinced that he was a child on the date of the offense, because there were a couple of sentences in the judgment. So I approached somebody else and we ultimately filed an appeal, a review in the matter. And in the review, this question of age was reopened on this ground only, that the question of age, which is very crucial for him, if he was a child below the age of, in this case, he was just 14 and a half actually, but he was held to be 19 years of age by the session judge, by whatever processes, etc. And we thought all the processes were completely illegal, completely against the direction of any law and Supreme Court judgments. So the Supreme Court in that case did reopen the question of fact, but exceptional circumstance. Otherwise, if the High Court has also examined the evidence and said, no, he was a child, Supreme Court would not have reopened. So there might be situations where, even though the matters has reached the topmost court, the question of fact was not re-examined. In this case, the judges said, no, the High Court has very categorically examined the evidence and have come to the conclusion that yes, there is enough evidence, oral evidence, to suggest that they have committed the offense. Now, what are the concluding remarks? Group 12. Did you find out?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, please.
Ma'am, concluding remark. This case of the Ramla Benta and Vankalev versus State of Hyderabad. The conclusion, after the study of whole course, the court found that the both appellant Ramla Benta and Bodla Ram are involved in the murder conspiracy of Moinuddin. The way they locked the door from outside and restrained deceased person employed to help him directly show the criminal intention of their menswear. The direct testimony against appellants, it is clear and cognate to bring charge home to them. Fourth one is, according to the evidence, one of the 5 prosecution witness 7, both these appellants lightened the match and set the fire to the house, that show that their cognate and common intention of them to murder Moinuddin. Though Section 34 of IPC is not adduced with Section 302, both are clear notice that they were charged with offense of murder. So Section 34 here is only an academic significance in this matter. After pursuing the whole case, the direct testimony against the appellant, and the appellant also confessed that they conspired to kill deceased. Then later on, they deny about their confession that they were not in their senses. Appellant too had fever at the time of confession. Confession was also not voluntarily made by them. So High Court go with the prosecution witness 7 and 4. They both are eyewitness of this whole matter, and the High Court go with the positive side of the matter. And after listening to many more evidence, the High Court didn't found any different reason from the conclusion of High Court dismissed the appeal of appellant 43 and 44 and accept 43 and 44 Ravan Premstar or Venkaidu or Bodla Ram and accept the reference for confirmation of the death sentence. This is all now.
Yeah. So ultimately they said no, because the circumstances very clearly showing only one conclusion is there, that it was a consequence. Whatever has happened is because of the pre-concerted plan to set the man the hut on fire after the man had, as usual, occupied the room and gone to sleep. So they knew what his routine was. They were aware that there was a man inside, and the man inside was also known to them who was the man inside. They wanted to kill him. And there's no doubt that on the evidence led by the prosecution, the charge of murder has been brought home against both the appellants. And 34 has already been explained, saying that even though the technical usage of 34 wasn't there, but in the substantive narration of the charge, they were given. So remember I said on the stages, there is one stage of framing of charges where the court holds a proper hearing. The purpose of that hearing is only to give clear information to the accused person as to what are being tried for. So suppose if during the trial, the charge hearing, the charge framed is 304, which is a lesser offense than 302. So during the evidence, etc., it is turned out that actually it is a case of murder. The judge cannot convict him for murder, for a higher offense. But if the charge was of a higher offense and a lesser offense is made out, then reverse can happen. So if the ingredients of the offenses are the same, so when we talk about murder, for example, it is a result of very grievous injuries caused to the person most of the time. Unless it's a case of hanging or that also some kind of other injuries will happen. But when it is by fire, it is by gun, it is wounds given by stabbing, by lathi charges, etc. So injuries lead to the consequence of death. So whether it is a case of grievous hurt only and by chance death happened, or whether it's a case of murder, the lesser offenses are still part of that murder. When you cause death by causing multiple stab wound to a person, the injury is basically, it may be basically and we will read cases where the conviction has come for a lesser offense. So in this case, so therefore, the basic principle is that the defense must get a very clear information as to what they have to defend themselves against. So suppose the trial was happening for robbery, that somebody entered the house and no charge was made of rape because there was no information given. And at some stage, it turns out that one of the burglars have also raped the girl in the house who did not complain at that point of time. Now, can this man be held guilty of rape along with the burglary? It will not, because unless he is given because he has not been able to defend anybody, to produce evidence in his defense against rape. So completely unconnected offense, if it has happened, then a fresh charge may come in. A fresh trial will become on that aspect. But in the trial already, which is happening on a certain charge, one cannot. So the other thing is also that you cannot have multiple prosecution for the same action. So one cannot say that, okay, I am charging you for murder today and you got acquitted, and now I will charge you for grievous hurt. So again, a fresh trial. So one cannot be cannot be tried for the same action twice. But the offense of rape and the offense of burglary are two different ones. So therefore, these are two different categories which may happen. So in this case, certainly none of that situation was there. They were given clear information. There is sufficient oral evidence, and there's nothing to challenge that evidence. Why I put in the middle part is that no question to what they deserve is the extreme penalty of the law. Whether it's a judgment before the amendments took place in law, the law required that extreme penalty of death must be given in all murder convictions. It is only after 1955 till 1973 that the judges were not required to give reasons. They said that there's no exception case to why they should not be given death penalty. This certainly will not apply today. Today, if the judge is giving death penalty in this case, they will have to have special reasons why death penalty must be given. It has to be very brutal, it has to be extraordinary, there has to be some special circumstance because of which death penalty can be given. So today, since 1973 onwards, it is just the reverse of what was the situation here in 1955. So given this is the reasoning, what I want you to very quickly go back to is, why we wanted to do this whole long exercise on a very small case. Yes?
Ma'am, I have a question, ma'am. Ma'am, in this case, ma'am, the both appellants conspired to kill a person, Moinuddin. And there are their employees of Moinuddin, they tried to prevent him to kill. At that time, if some of one of them, that prosecution, the witnesses of them, lost something expensive thing, or because of appellant, at the time of the beating, someone lost their expensive thing because of that whole matter. Can they adduce the remedy for whatever they lost in the same case?
No, suppose I set the house on fire and the fireman came to extinguish the fire and he suffered injuries.
Yes.
So that may be one instance, and that the fireman himself suffers a lot of injuries because of the fire. So the whole yeah.
No.
Losing your body part. Suppose he has to then, his arm was amputated because the fire, he suffered the loss in the fire. The person who has come with the responsibility to extinguish fire. It's like, suppose I was rescuing and a whole bunch of money fell out my pocket because as I was picking up the injured person and the whole money got burnt. That may be one scenario, no? This is the kind of scenario I think you're talking about.
Yes.
So in that one, whether certainly there will be no criminal liability, because this is neither a reasonably foreseeable loss, nor he intended it, neither he was intending this loss to be caused to this rescuer, nor he desired this loss. So certainly no criminal liability can come. But whether any civil liability it's not a contractual liability. That will also not happen to the accused person. Accused can be held liable for only those losses which are foreseeable by him. And that's also a very interesting question, which we will look at another case we have, that a man gave a poisoned halwa to another man. This man did not like the taste of the halwa, so he threw the halwa. The younger, his own niece, picked up that halwa, shared the halwa with a friend of hers in the neighborhood, and both the children died. Now the question is whether the first man who had given the poisoned halwa, is he liable for the death of these two children? And we have a very interesting case here, and it is in our materials. And we have a difference of opinion in the matter. One judge says, minority says that no, he is responsible. The majority in this case said no, he's not responsible. And we've got very good reasoning. It's a very interesting judgment to look at. So certainly for criminal liability, one of the arguments is, and once we have a minority majority judgment, which is important to appreciate, that today maybe this one judge who is dissenting is minority, tomorrow he might be in a majority with another judge. And this shows us that how different possible arguments are available on the same facts and same law being applied. Different sections can lead to a different argument. We'll read that. But as far as your example is concerned, this is a case where he has suffered a loss. But has he suffered a loss because of the action by the accused person? So if we say, oh, he caused the fire and therefore the loss is caused by him. But the other one is that who asked you to come and rescue? You are doing it out of goodwill, or you might be a policeman who has completed. But whether you were expecting that injury as an accused person.
Ma'am, so can Qasim Khan, who was bitten by the appellants, so can he claim the damages or the remedies?
He can, no, if he has been given grievous injuries, he can certainly prosecute. So that will be a separate trial.
Okay.
But then it's a different accused person, different victim. But if suppose they were, what has been stated is that they beat them up and they threw dust in their eyes. That's how they prevented them. There is no mention that anybody lost a limb, anybody fell down, lost a tooth, broke a bone, nothing of that, because what the whole categories of grievous hurt are not mentioned. So all these injuries will be mentioned as hurt have been caused. Nuisance might be there might be other offenses, but certainly if it is not a cognizable offense and those people did not file a complaint to the magistrate, as we talked about earlier, that if it's an NCR, non-cognizable report, prosecution will not happen in such cases. So look, we have spent 3 hours discussing this one case, and this is not how we are going to read all the cases. But this is what I wanted to explain to you or show to you, what that the range of information available, the range of knowledge available, knowledge of procedural law, of evidence, of appreciation of evidence, of reasoning, building arguments, it's all there. Every single case is rich with a lot of knowledge. You will not need all this knowledge for your exam at the end of the semester. But you will need all this knowledge if you want to practice law. Delhi University, we teach by case method system. So case method system want us to examine lots of aspects and learn lots of things. And it enables us to learn a lot of things. If you were to open a textbook on this aspect, what you will see in a textbook will be one sentence perhaps there. That when 2 men locked the hut from outside and set the house on fire and prevented any person to come to rescue to the man, and the man inside shouted for help, but he died because of the burn injuries. These 2 men are guilty of murder because it is a case clearly showing the intention to cause death. This is all that you might know. This may be the biggest, longest reference you might find in textbook to this case. So what you learn from there is very simple, one-dimensional information that if there is clear, if it is clearly made out from the facts that there was an intention to kill, the person can be held liable for murder. You will learn nothing more. But the way we have examined it, how many things have we learned? We have learned session judge is the first court where trial takes place. We have learned anybody can file an FIR without being connected with the offense. We have learned so many things in this judgment, isn't it? So it's up to you that how much you want to learn from each case. You can do 2 kinds of learnings in each case. One kind of learning which is focused for the exam. That in the exam, these are the questions I will be addressing, and in the exam, the only question we will be addressing on this aspect will be how to prove intentional. One very small component of the offense of murder. So from that angle, the only thing will be these 3 sentences that I've just spoken, 2 sentences. There is circumstances show that no other explanation but the intention to cause death. So if that is the only learning you want to do, you need not read the case. You can read that from the textbook. But if you want to extend your learning, you want to expand your understanding of how facts are used to give different interpretations. So when you look at in this case, the initial statement of fact by the prosecution, a lot more facts were then brought out in detail by the defense to say, no, first time the stick was lighted, then it got extinguished. The second time this was not mentioned in the initial story. So a lot more details can be how you can, when you bring up more details, the interpretation of the facts may be different. You are now raising a doubt whether who wanted to set the house on fire. So examining the cases, reading the law through cases is much more enriching experience. So going back to the slide, the initial slide I want to go back to show that what are the different parts of various things that we can learn. We started with this. There are 4 essential elements. Then we said the first principle of liability. Anyone who will read? What is the common law principle? Please read. Actus non fecit reum, nisi mens sit rea. Yeah, this is something you have to remember by heart. And the meaning of this phrase is, the act itself does not make a man guilty. Man, when we say, we are using it inclusive of women as well, unless their intentions were so. So with this principle, we also looked at various mental stages, and we'll be looking at all these sections in relevant case law, including talking about these intentions. These are the words used in the legislation to indicate intention, but we also have some sections which do not use any of these terms, which can indicate a mental intention. And therefore, the first case we will read after this will be, if the section is silent, then whether the principle applies or not. If he doesn't have the intention to cause the offense, whether he can be held liable or not. It's very important to make the distinction between intention and motive. Volition precedes any action. The desire for the act is the volition. The longing for the object desired, the ultimate purpose because of which we are doing it. So in this case, what was the ultimate purpose? One was, there was a dispute. So what he wanted to do by killing this man was settle the dispute and get hold of the properties. There will be no one to defend the properties. So that's the motive, the purpose, ulterior purpose because of which I am doing the present action. Intention is the expectation that the desired motions will lead to certain consequences. That's what is intention. Put it in another words. How to prove intention? Okay, this is kind of coming to all these further details. This is not what I was referring. Okay, we can go through this. So for passing exam, that when you read the judgment, not from our case material, but from the reporter, many reporters give head notes, which is a brief of what the judgment is all about. These head notes, many people in competition, many students in the competitions come referring to a case by reference to the head note, which is not a good thing at all. Head notes are prepared by second year and third year students of law. So it is their understanding. Sometimes they do a great job, sometimes they don't. But unless you look at the original judgment, so head notes are useful to determine whether I want to read the full case. But if I'm going to use that case for any of my court works, for any of my arguments in the moot courts, then I must read the full judgment. Because it may be that the person who made the head note, and head notes are not binding, they are not part of the decision, these are added by later on by young legal scholars. So one can read the, so one purpose will be for passing examination, you read head notes, you read dukis, you read short guidebooks, and your purpose is done. Then other purpose may be that acquiring knowledge for the profession of law. And here, this is what we have done in this particular case, that we have looked at the legal provision, we have looked at fact, investigation, procedure, evidence, a lot of details are there. So we have looked at all these aspects because we are preparing ourselves for profession of law. And law faculty does, this case method system does prepare students for the profession of law if they want to be taking that profession. And these are also the reason for reading a case, because you are locating a precedent, something which you can say, similar facts, this was decided, in my case also this should be decided. The law was interpreted in this manner and such case, and this is the interpretation which must be applied in my case. So in order to quote a precedent, that may be the reason for reading a case. The It may be for research purposes. What is the direction in which law has taken? So when I mentioned to you the fact of the death penalty, it is a growth in the area of death penalty. Prior to 1955, death penalty was the norm. 55 to 73, either could be given. From 73 onwards, very categorically opposite position, you must not give death penalty. So certainly if you're not looking, you might be wanting to analyze how the law has changed, what has been the viewpoint at one point of time, what was the time taken at that point of time, 1 year, within 1 year disposal in a murder trial, what is the time taken today? So there might be different reasons because of which people read the law. How is the functional aspect? So when somebody today mentioned that one party was, the deceased was a Muslim in this case. So sometime it may also be when you want to make, we recently had the previous former vice president saying that Muslims in the country are feeling very insecure. So he is looking at the functional aspect of the law. Who are the parties involved? Who was in this case, we know that here it has been mentioned that the deceased was a village patel. But do we know who are these two other people? The accused person, which caste they belong to, which, what is their background, etc. We find no mention, while the status of the deceased has been mentioned. So whether it was the status of the deceased vis-a-vis the accused person, which has given rise to such prompt actions, there are a lot of questions of functioning aspect of the law as well. We do know that if an uneducated poor man goes to file an FIR, and if a VIP comes to file an FIR, the response, the functional response of the police will be very different. So that may be another reason why you want to learn it there. So personality of the judge, lawyers, parties, values, situations, media focus, all these aspects also have an impact. And we will look at one of the kidnapping cases from that aspect as well. So head notes. This is what the head notes in this case were. This is how it looks like. We remove lots of things when we give you the case materials. So it says section 300, where the accused, remember this is what I was reading. So the 2 points they have said in this case, the head notes. 1, 300, when the accused set fire to the cottage and the deceased was sleeping. Before doing so, took care to lock the door, prevented the servant to come to rescue, and the person was burnt alive. Yes.
Ma'am, is any public pressure or media trial create the pressure on the judgment given by the judges? We have seen several cases in a...
You think they are not human beings? They are human beings.
Yeah. But as a court of law, we do with a legal process, not on public pressure.
That's true. That's true. But we are all, because I was at the academy at one point of time, and I learned there are two kinds of judges. One set of judges never read news. They never looked at TV news in order to be prevented from having any impact on the media reporting. The other set of judges said that no, we have to be consciously keeping this, whatever the media is saying, we have to keep it aside when we sit on that table, on that seat. For me, the judges who were, both of them were trying to be saying, both of them recognize that we must not be influenced by the media. The one set of judges realize that even though this is our job, but we will get influenced because we are also human beings. The other set assert that no, we are superhuman beings, we will not be affected. But either way, the one who is not reading the newspapers will not even know what the people are thinking, not only in terms of this case, but generally speaking, what is the conversation on feminism, on human rights violations? Generally speaking, which direction is the country or the world going? They will be cocooned in 1920. They will not know what has happened by the time 2021 has come. So certainly there are pluses and minuses. So media is only one kind of influence, which is what is even more problematic is the judges' life experiences, judges' experience, ideology. And these are hidden even from the judge. The judge may not himself or herself know that what are their biases. There was a woman judge, and at the academy, at one point of time, we had this discussion about woman judge and a man judge. And she says, no, judge is just a judge. There is no man or a woman judge. Judge is gender neutral. So then we went through lots of gender selection programs and all. And at the end of the day, she does say that, no, when I reflect back on my judgeship, I do realize that actually in divorce cases or in domestic violence cases, I was harsher on the women litigants because I felt, in her own life, she was dealing with a lot of domestic unrest. And she was putting it up all because whatever she thought was good for her daughter. So she expected all women to make those compromises unknowingly. She's a very, very fine judge, very committed, very sincere judge, very hardworking judge. But she herself had not realized that she was actually expecting more commitment and more sacrifices from the women in the marriage than from the men because of her personal experiences. But with this exposure, she of course acknowledged that yes, there are so many hidden biases. In one of the programs, we were talking about a new age couple, lesbian couple, who had produced a child without, through the IVF, with an unknown donor. So there was no father figure in that child's growth. So as an adult, now he's not looking after these modern mothers. He has two mothers. So the off-the-cuff remark of the judge in the training program was that, oh, he's justified. He must be very angry. What he must have gone through. So this was her inner feelings. And of course, when confronted, she said, no, 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 when I sit on the chair, I will keep it all out. But that's not humanly possible. No? So the possibility of influence is very much there. And that is why the training of judges focuses on this aspect, that you should be aware of your own influences, of your own feelings, about your own thoughts, so that you can keep them aside if they're not in accordance with the constitutional values. So, okay. So this is what this section, this is briefly the head notes say. In this case, these are pretty good head notes, but not necessarily so in all the cases, and therefore one has to be very careful when you're looking at the head notes. Then, title of the case. So look, somebody said, why Bodlaram is not there? This is how the actual title looked at, Rahul Venkalu and another. So again, in the actual court papers, Bodlaram's name will also be there on the title, but not here. Now the citation, do you know how to read the citation? What does it tell us? It tells us the hard print of this case is available in a reporter called All India Reporter. The judgment was given in 1956. In 1956, the law of 55 before they will still apply, because the law on the date of the offense applies whenever the judgment is decided. SC here stands for Supreme Court, and 177 stands here for page number. So you want to read a hard copy. Today, of course, it's available on the website itself also. But this is how the information, the condensed information about this citation, this is called a citation. So this is the citation of the case. The JJ at the end, two capital J's with a full stop, stands for judges. So these are two judges which have given this, Bose Jagannath Das and Sinha. The date of the decision, 7th October 1955. It was published in 56, but the decision has come on this date. Then criminal appeals from which cases it has arisen. So numbers have been given there. This is all part of the title of the case. From criminal appeal to confirmation, and from Hyderabad, all these, the date of the deed slashes referring to the date of the judgment there. So then we have our cases started. What I wanted to go back to, I'll stop this slide and have to share another one. But what I need to emphasize to you is the requirement of intention. Okay. I want us to look at these 4 things I've written here. When we're talking about intention, we need to, suppose I'll give you some examples and you will tell me what is the intention you can make out there, whether there was an intention to cause, whether there was intention to cause injury. And our action, first of all, whether there was an intention or not, and then what was the intention. So in order to say that, yes, this person has an intention, there should be reasonable foreseeability that death or injury will be the consequence, and there is desire for such death or injury. Okay. So with this, let's think of certain situations. So there are 2-3 men who are beating another man with lathis. They very carefully give lathi blows to this one man on the hands and legs. There is no injury given to him on any vital part of the body. They gave him lots of blows. 27 injuries are caused on the hands and legs just by beating with the lathis. This man dies 3 days after the incident. Now, whether we can say that these injuries were given intentionally by these 2 persons, 2 or 3, let's say 3 accused were there. So can we say these injuries which have been caused to this man on the arms and legs were caused intentionally?
Yes, of course.
Yes, of course. Why? Because you have to formulate your full sentence. Why? Because they could reasonably foresee that injury will be the consequence. So how can we say that, yes, they could foresee, but why? How can we say that they had the desire for this injury?
Ma'am, they beat him with 27 blows and all. There must be
They're given it repeatedly. So if you are carrying a ladder on your bike and somebody gets hurt on the way, injury has been given. You can reasonably foresee that injury may happen if you carry a ladder on the bike like this, or a pole you're carrying. So reasonable possibility is there. But are you wanting to cause injury? No. So certainly there is no, in that instance, when people carry things, we have found this also. On trucks, they're carrying things and things are protruding out. At the back, lots of, let's say, iron rods are protruding. And the truck stopped at a place unexpectedly. And the riders at the back got injured because these iron rods got into my body. Whether the truck driver can be said to have caused the injury intentionally to me?
No. There was no desire to bring that injury.
So there was a reasonable possibility that it can injure, but you did not pay attention. So what is the state of mind?
Negligence.
Negligence. And so you have to learn to distinguish that what is the kind of mental state that this action has been done, whether this has been done with the intention, and what is the intention, so unless there is a desire for the consequence, it is not done with the criminal intent required. So in the case we said he had the intention, the first case where 27 blows have been given and the man dies. Can we say they had the intention to kill the accused person? The victim?
Yes. Yes.
Why would you say that? Can you say that there was a reasonable possibility that this man will die and that they desired the death? Can you say that?
Ma'am, after 27 blows, any normal human is supposed to die, or at least go into coma or something like that.
Why would you think that they were not, if they wanted him dead, then they could have beaten him on his head? Why were they being careful that he is given injuries only on arms and legs?
And they didn't injure any vital part of that person.
So can we say that they were intending to kill?
No, ma'am. Only just they want to beat him, or
This is what is clear is that they had intention to injure.
Ma'am, it can be culpable homicide.
We are not into what is the offense. We are still only looking about the state of mind, because we have a proper case on this subject, where we will look at this whole question of 299 and 300 distinction. What we are trying to do at this point of time is that whether, because we said it's an inference from facts. So in this case, in Venkaru's case, how did we come to the conclusion they had intention? Because they could reasonably foresee that death will be the consequence if they lock the hut outside and prevent anybody to come to rescue. Then, did they desire it? Yes, if they did not desire it, they would not have done it. There is no other explanation. It was not that by chance I was carrying something, I was carrying an explosive and it exploded by chance. They were doing everything intentionally, and they have given us no explanation. If they did not want death of the Moinuddin, they need to explain. They need to say, why did we prevent the servant to rescue the Moinuddin once we got to know Moinuddin is inside? But the argument was that we were only setting the house on fire. If that was your only intention, then there was no need to lock the door from outside. Wanted to set the house on fire, why would you lock the door? Unless you know there is somebody inside. So very categorically, the facts leaves no doubt in our mind. But in these 27 injuries on heads and legs, we do not know that they intended to kill him. What is sure is that he is certainly intended to cause injury to this person. So of course, that is also murder. They will still be held liable for murder, but through a different subclause of Section 300. Because now, and that's what we will learn gradually, that how do you distinguish firstly of 300 and thirdly of 300. At this point of time, we are trying to put only this understanding in our knowledge, how we determine whether the act has been done intentionally or not. So you are in a crowded bus and you trampled on somebody's foot while trying to get down from the bus. Have you intentionally caused have you intentionally caused hurt?
No, ma'am.
Why not?
No, ma'am.
Ma'am, we have a class on the wait.
Already?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, 3:55. Okay. So the only point we need to, have you put your attendance? खुद ही लगाए करो आते ही. So the point we are wanting to re-emphasize is that when you trampled on somebody's foot, you knew there was a reasonable possibility that you might trample on somebody's foot. But you did not desire this to happen. You do not want somebody passes by you and tramples on your foot. You know that it's a crowded bus, it's a possibility, but nobody has a desire to cause you pain by trampling on your foot. So unless we have got both the things together, reasonable forcibility and the desire for the consequences which are reasonably foreseeable, the action is not said to be caused by intention. So intention can be to do anything. Intention can be to cause death, injury, grievous hurt, to defame somebody. So intention is something we were focusing at by reference to the first principle. So for our tomorrow's class, what have we listed here is for third, Palani Gaundan. So when I did the act, I had one intention, but the consequence was a completely different one. So you look at, because when they say your actus reus with the mens rea should lead to a consequence for the criminal liability. But if there is no coherence between the two, then what happens? So we will look at Palani Gaundan tomorrow. We will not look Palani Gaundan with the full details as we talked about Venkalu. We want to look at it from the perspective of the coexistence, the requirement of coexistence between the two. So we meet tomorrow.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Everybody read Palani Gaundan for tomorrow.